Hello and welcome to Thrive Online. My name is Declan and I'm joined today by Alex Cooney, CEO and co-founder of CyberSafeKids. Alex, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Just as a quick heads up before we start, we are .ie, Ireland's national domain name registry, and we are strong believers in the good that the internet can bring to local communities, businesses, and everyday people. So we launched a podcast, Thrive Online. Each episode will be an informal discussion with experts to talk about how people and businesses can stay safe online and use the internet to its full potential. If you want more information on who we are, you can go to www.weare.ie. But that's out of the way, so let's jump into it. So, Alex, obviously CEO, co-founder of CyberSafeKids. For those who haven't heard of the organization, could you talk to us a little bit about what it is and what its mission is?
Yeah, so CyberSafeKids is a charity we set up 10 years ago. I'm one of the co-founders, as you said. And essentially, we wanted to bridge the gap that we saw between children's access to the online world, which we saw as fairly substantial, and the guidance and education in general that they were getting to be safe and smart online. So to that end, we launched an education program in January 2016. And since then, we've spoken to nearly 100,000 children across the country. We also speak to parents, caregivers, educators, social workers, foster carers, pretty much anyone that has an interest in working with or caring for children. And we run campaigns. So, for example, Same Rules Apply, which is one that we launched on Safer Internet Day, which is really simple messaging, trying to encourage parents to think about parenting their children online as they would offline. So we make analogies like road safety or, safety around water, things like that. And then we gather trends and usage data and we publish this into a report each September. And we've been doing that for a number of years. So we've kind of got this real sense, very detailed sense of what children are actually doing online. So this is all kind of self-reports from children from 8 up to 16. So it's pretty comprehensive. And it's typically based on thousands of responses every year. And it gives us a sense of, those levels of access they have, where they're access, on what device, on, which social media, messaging, gaming apps they are using, how they're using them, the levels of supervision they have, the positive and negative experiences they're having online. So it's a really tremendous insight into children's online lives.
Yeah, that's just touching on what you said. Like an analogy that I've often heard with digital and the internet is that it is like cars, and that, we're all born in like the kind of this age where like there are cars and cars are great and, can help and are fantastic vehicles, but you also need to learn how to use them and to stay safe and to learn the road, traffic laws and everything. So I imagine like it would be the same, I guess, with internet and digital, where we live in like this digital world, and it's fantastic, but you need to just educate yourselves on how to, stay safe and to do it responsibly.
Yeah, we find the road safety analogy a really good one because, of course, there's loads of opportunities to being able to be an independent road user. So if you're kind of looking at it from the perspective of a child, so, as a pedestrian or a cyclist, there's huge opportunity to being able to go off with your friends on your bike, but there's a level of preparation that you need in order to get to that place where you can go off independently, and it requires lots of interaction from your parents, reminders, conversations around it, education in schools. The use of safeguards. So we think of a toddler and their first experience with a bike and the training wheels and the helmet and the knee pads, and you're in a safe place to start off, and your parent is often running alongside you. We're so used to that, the idea that we need to teach our kids to ride a bike safely, that we don't even, it's not just something we pass on from one generation to the next. This is a little different in that even though those same principles apply, and which is what the kind of Same Rules Apply campaign is about, a lot of parents today weren't parented on it themselves. So they feel a bit out of step, on the back foot, overwhelmed. You can use any term, but it comes back to the same thing. They're not quite sure how to do this. So it's really important that we do upskill and give confidence and support parents. We really have a huge amount of empathy for parents trying to navigate their children through these online environments. We are very balanced in the sense that we do see the opportunity. We're not in denial. Children are growing up in a digital age. We want them to thrive online. To take the title of this podcast, it should all be about getting to a place where children can absolutely thrive online and offline, and that they're given all those opportunities. But in order to do that, we've got to mitigate against the risks. We've got to address those risks. And part of that is parental guidance, part of that's education, and part of that is changes in the tech industry.
Yeah, I was just kind of snickering a second ago because I was just reminded trying to explain to my parents when I was growing up that email is not a chat room, because they heard that they saw that I got like a Hotmail account, and they're like, well, what strangers are you talking to? It's like only my friends who also have my email. But yeah, I guess that's, gets back to, this is technology that they themselves didn't grow up with. So it could be a little daunting to understand it. But yeah, I guess, based on that then, on the research that CyberSafeKids has sort of conducted, what would you say are your current top of mind concerns that really impact children and youth today?
Yeah, so in the simplest terms, what we see is that children have this enormous level of access from a very young age, and that they're not being adequately prepared for that access. They're not getting the levels of supervision and guidance that they need in order to kind of manage that access. But they're also going into online environments that are not set up for children. That's the kind of basic problem here. They're ill-equipped and they're going into spaces that are not designed for them. So we're going to need to address this issue from both of those sides, or both those angles, which, coming back to the education and parental guidance. The risks are things like exposure to inappropriate content. And, pretty much anything you didn't want a child to see is available at click of a button. Pornography, violent, terror, torture type content. It's having, when we know this, an impact on mental health and well-being. We see it as one of the key contributors to some of those rises in anxiety and depression in children and young people. There's issues like cyberbullying. Bullying has existed since time began. This is another tool in the toolkit of a bully, and it's of course much amplified and more constant because of the nature of the online world. So you'd see it traditionally that the bullying would end at the school, when the school day ended and the school gates closed, that bullying finished for that day. Whereas this is very different, and it's maybe harder to pick up in some cases as well. We see grooming, sexual extortion, both of which are rising. If you look at some of the global agencies that are monitoring these trends, like the NCMEC in the US, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, that produces this excellent cyber tip line report every year, that has pointed to exponential increases, particularly since COVID, it has to be said. So when you look at the growth in some of these trends since 2019, it's shocking. An example would be in their last report, they were looking at grooming, instances of grooming, and between 2021 and 2023, there was a 320% increase in incidents of grooming reported to them. So these problems are huge and growing. You've got the issues of things like mis and disinformation and how that is shaping children's understanding. We know because there's plenty of publicised evidence to show that children largely get their news source from online sources and places like social media. We also know that those companies behind those services aren't always good at clamping down on mis and disinformation. You hear companies like Meta taking a step back. X obviously already had. And that's deeply worrisome when you consider that this is where children and young people are getting their information. So quite a range there. And then the sort of more day-to-day stuff of just simply sharing too much, the digital footprint being kind of, unhelpful and unwieldy and potentially impacting on future lives, applications for jobs, applications to educational, higher education and so on. So they're wide-ranging.
Do you think that, obviously there's a lot of, horrific content, and I think that that's, at front of mind for a lot of people. But do you also think that there's risks that people just aren't really kind of considering or expecting, considering overuse? Or I think a lot of people also kind of put an emphasis on smartphones, but, I know someone who was horribly cyberbullied, but it wasn't through a smartphone. It was through his gaming console. Do you think that there's kind of an overfocus on regulating smartphone use, and there's not enough about, looking at other ways of accessing harmful content?
Oh, 100%. I think in Ireland, we've heard a lot of the media discussion and, discussion around schools centering on smartphones. And there's an interesting grassroots movement of parents growing. I still think they're probably the minority, but it is definitely growing. A growing consensus around the fact that, children probably should be a bit older and a bit more mature before they get their first device. But it centers on smartphones, and it centers on holding off on smartphones. And actually, it's any device. And I would say one of the things that we need to look at most is things like children using devices overnight in bedrooms. A parent was telling me recently that she'd always been really strict about keeping the phone out of the bedroom. And then one night she got up, to go to the bathroom or something, and noticed a light under her teenage daughter's door, and went in to find she was on her school iPad. She'd been able to bypass the restrictions and was using Snapchat at 1:00 in the morning. So we absolutely need to have this mindfulness around all devices that connect to the internet and where children are using them, especially when they're younger. Our trends and usage report does show we survey, as I said, children from 8 up. So we're seeing this incredible, really, levels of access. Even from those young ages, 94% of the 8 to 12-year-olds that we surveyed had their own smart device. And we break that down into the different devices. So an 8 to 10-year-old is much more likely to have a tablet or a games console than they are a phone. The phone ownership has tended over the years to increase at 11 specifically. But even a quarter of 8 and 9-year-olds will have a smartphone. So I think we need to look at this. Where are they accessing, on what devices, but also what are they accessing? And as you alluded to there, around kind of addiction, and the fact that, some of the stuff that we're using on these devices is designed to hold our attention for as long as possible. And then that can be deeply problematic in terms of, the well-being of that child.
Yeah, that's actually a good kind of point I wanted to make. Or ask about rather, we all saw Adolescence lately, and it was a very good show, very scary show. But one of my own personal problems with it is I found that there was putting a lot of this emphasis on the responsibility of the child or of the parent, and that was kind of the main thing that they were talking about. But there wasn't really a lot of conversation about the platforms or the government or legislation. Whose responsibility is it to keep children and youth safe online? Is it government, platforms, or parents, or is it, does it have to be a shared responsibility?
Yeah, look, there's a really interesting point that you raised there about the responsibility of tech platforms and what came up in that show. And there is plenty of evidence. So that was obviously a fictional account of a child being very negatively impacted by what they were being exposed to online. But there's plenty of evidence to show that what, he was seeing, that fictional child was seeing, is a true account. The Anti-Bullying Centre here in Ireland led some research a few years ago under Professor Debbie Ging, which outlined exactly the type of content that's being served up to boys and young men in particular through platforms like YouTube and TikTok. And in the case of TikTok, it was about a third of the recommended content being served up to the accounts was of this kind of misogynistic, manosphere, anti-feminist type content. And on YouTube, I think it was close to 2/3 of all the content that was being served up through the recommender system. I mean, that is phenomenal in terms of the influence that has. There have been other studies by bodies like the Center for Countering Digital Hate that have looked at what is being served up to girls around, for example, eating disorders and body image. We know also from books like The Careless People by Sarah Wynne Williams, which was an account of her time in a senior public policy position at Meta, that there were practices that she recounted of, a girl posting a picture of her, a selfie, and then removing it, clearly dissatisfied in some way with it, and then being automatically served up a beauty ad just to highlight further, any feelings of inadequacy that she might be feeling. This was an opportunity to potentially sell her something. So I think we really need to scrutinize the practices of these tech companies. It's, of course, not entirely their responsibility. Parents have an enormous role to play in terms of they're the decision makers around when the child gets that first access, on what device they're getting that access, when they're getting that, all of these questions. So we definitely need to work with parents and support them and upskill them, because we do feel that parents are, very much on the back foot here. But I would put an enormous amount of responsibility on tech companies for these designs, the very design of the services that children are using. We know that they know the age of children because they're advertising to them based on their age and their gender and their location, and in some cases, other indications like their sexuality. So they have this enormously detailed profile. So when we talk about underage users and they pretend they don't know about them, or, they do everything in their power to keep them off, we know that's not true. And we have our trends and usage data that shows that, that shows there are plenty of underage users still using these services, and that they aren't doing enough to protect even those users who are allowed on the 13 plus cohort. We need online environments that are safe by design for children. And that means we're going to need to look at things like the recommender algorithm, the stuff that they can access and share through those platforms. So there's an enormous amount to look at here. And what I see in the last few months is a step away from that responsibility rather than in any way stepping into it. There's been some progress, but it is overshadowed, unfortunately, by the lack of accountability that has been on show. And I also think we've had legislation over the last couple of decades that's been unhelpful in terms of where responsibility lies, because it has essentially let these companies off the hook in terms of the content that flows on their platforms and the practices that they're using. That is shifting. We're seeing, the Digital Services Act at the European level. We're seeing our own national legislation. But does it capture and address all the harm? Absolutely not. Does it really get us to a place where we have an internet that is safe by design for children? No. So I feel like we've still a long way to go.
And then even if there's the legislative framework hypothetically that did capture all of this, do you feel like the government is doing enough to enforce the actual laws on these tech platforms and to sort of make them be compliant or bring them into compliance to properly moderate the content on their platforms?
So historically, no, and I think there's been a concern on the part of policymakers that this is very complex and it is too hard to regulate. And, how would you go about it? You can see it even in some of the policy discussions that there is almost a lack of understanding. That should change now that we have these new pieces of legislation. So we have the Online Safety and Media Regulation Act in Ireland. We have Commissioner Mann. We have an Online Safety Commissioner. We have a Digital Services Commissioner too, because we host of the 25 services that have been identified under the Digital Services Act as being very large online platforms or very large online search engines. We host in Ireland, I think, 15 of the 25. 5. So we have quite a responsibility in relation to regulating those services. But it's really too early to say whether enforcement will be effective. That hasn't really started properly. Yes, there are some cases that are starting to unfold at the European level in terms of the recommender system, so it'd be really good to see how those play out. There's been some, obviously, investigations brought by the Data Protection Commission as well around some of these practices in relation to children's data and privacy. So big fines being issued. I don't know how many of them actually have been paid yet because I think they're being appealed. But nonetheless, we're starting to see these changes. Time will tell in terms of enforcement, and time will also tell in relation to whether they go far enough. If you take something like the Digital Services Act, obviously there is a particular focus on these very large entities, which are defined as having 45 plus million subscribers in Europe per month. So if you fall below that threshold in terms of size, you will be regulated, but not as in any way as robustly as those bigger entities. And our concern is things like gaming platforms just fall below that radar. Roblox, for example, is massively popular with children in Ireland. 40% of the 8 to 12-year-olds that we surveyed last year were playing Roblox. And it doesn't come under a national legislation. And it doesn't meet the size threshold at the European level. So they miss out on some of the key elements of that regulation. We also see platforms like WhatsApp, which are massively popular as well, that don't come under a national legislation because they're considered private communications platforms, even though you can have up to 1,000 users in a group. And they don't come under the DSA either, presumably because of the same reasons. So we're missing out on opportunities to better protect children across all online environments in which they gather. And you see interesting developments outside of Europe, like in Australia. You may be aware that they've introduced this legislation to ban social media for children under the age of 16. But even there, and again, we don't know how that will work. We don't know what enforcement will look like. It's too early to tell. But even there, they're not talking about gaming platforms. They're not talking about YouTube. I mean, YouTube is massively popular with this younger age cohort, and there are issues in terms of their recommender system and the content that they are serving up to children and young people. Again, the Centre for Countering Digital Hate has looked at this, as have other bodies, in terms of type of content and harmful content that's being served up to children and young people. So YouTube won't be on it, WhatsApp won't be on it, gaming platforms won't. So I think we're talking about bans, which is unhelpful to my mind. We need to be talking about addressing harm so that across the board, so that children can safely participate in these online environments, because, they have a right to actively participate in the world as it is. And the world is partially online.
To what extent? It sounds like a lot of it is a design issue. I mean, like, parents and guardians can have as many conversations with their children about like online safety as they want, but at the end of the day, if the apps are designed to be addictive, or if like the algorithm is designed to be harmful, and just the legislation doesn't have any teeth to make them not harmful, it sounds like it really does work against youth, parents, youth and guardians to try and protect them and to shield them from harmful exposure, I guess.
Well, it means that some parents are kind of saying, well, if I can't protect them, I'm just going to hold off. I'm not going to give them access.
But then it just turns into prohibition.
It turns into prohibition, but we then aren't preparing them either. So what we would say is, give them access, but supervised access, and at an appropriate time when you think it's the right time developmentally for your child, not because of social pressure. So often we talk to parents who say, well, I had to give them the device, or I had to give them access to Snapchat because everybody else was on it, and my child was, it was going to be social suicide effectively if I didn't allow that access. And we need to change that dynamic so that it's much easier for parents to decide in the best interest of their child.
It does get to the same rules kind of thing. Like, you wouldn't give your child a pet because everyone else in the class had a pet. You would give them a pet if you were confident that they could handle the responsibility and that they knew that it wasn't just, for Christmas. It's a long-term, obligation.
Yeah, you wouldn't give a toddler an adult bike. I often say that. Imagine giving a toddler an adult bike and saying, off you go. Without the preparation, without giving them the trainer tools and it's just, you wouldn't give them the keys to a car without, so let's think about this in practical terms. we do need to obviously prepare children better and give them that support and supervision. So we often say to parents, keep them where you can see them. Have defined times where they can be on their games console or on their tablet, but have them where it's much easier for you to check in. So that if you're in the kitchen doing stuff or you're in your office, have them where you can see them in the living room, in the kitchen, that you can more easily check in. Keep the headphones off so you can more easily hear the conversations. I do think there are things that we can be doing, that are much more measured and supportive of our children's learning about being online in a safe way. And we don't even need to give them their own devices. We can have family devices, that it remains a privilege to use rather than a right. So I do think there's lots of things that parents can do, but ultimately, going back to your original point, they're going into online environments that are simply not designed with their safety in mind. And this remains a problem.
We'll stop here for a break. I will say this might get me a bit into trouble, but if my parents are listening, I will say that the video game ban we had growing up as children did not work. The prohibition was not effective. We did find ways around it. But yeah, I think that is a good kind of to illustrate your point of, bans are not by themselves necessarily that effective and could actually have adverse impacts. But yeah, we'll stop there for a quick advert break.
For 25 years, Ireland's digital story has been unfolding, and .ie has been right at the heart of it, every step of the way. .ie is passionate about enabling and empowering Ireland to leverage the internet for the good of its society and economy. As the trusted national registry, .ie protects Ireland's unique online identity and empowers people, communities and businesses to thrive online. So buy a .ie today and elevate your digital identity with a trusted, resilient and accessible .ie internet domain. .ie, celebrating 25 years in business. Here's to the journey ahead with you. For more information and to get your .ie domain today, please visit www.weare.ie.
And we are back with Alex, CEO and co-founder of CyberSafeKids. So Alex, obviously, last few years, there's been a lot of hype with new emerging technologies as well. We have Gen AI. There's the issue of deepfakes. Is the advice that you're giving to people today the same as it was 5 years ago, or has it just drastically, changed or been altered?
I mean, in some senses, the general guiding principles remain the same in terms of certainly parenting, like keeping an eye on what they're doing, having regular conversations, making sure privacy settings are on, that you're using the parental controls that are available to you at device level, at app level, and so on. So those things remain constant. And in a way, it's really important to remind parents, don't get too distracted by the fact that it's another app, another game. These same principles still apply. It does make it a little harder when the more apps and games they're on, that does make it a little harder to keep an eye on them. But yeah, there are new emerging technologies which certainly complicate the picture, and things like the recommender algorithm have become a much bigger focus. They've become more sophisticated. Our feeds aren't just based on our friendships and our interests. It's a lot of that's being determined by what we're engaging with online, and they know that some of these stronger emotions like fear and hate, increase engagement. So it's being manipulated. Generative AI is tremendously exciting in lots of ways. There are certain fields like the medical field, and I use ChatGPT when I go off to say you're a weekend away in a new country and you only have a limited amount of time. It's fantastic. You can just say, okay, what are the best things I should see in a day in Rome or whatever. There's great fun to be had with some of these things and great creative potential. But for children, there is also risk, right? And the amplification of mis and disinformation. And if you read the small print of a lot of these services, you'll see that they can't guarantee that accurate information will return. And they've tried to dress up in some cases these features as friends. Like Snapchat was a good example. They created the My AI feature, and initially it was just on their subscriber feed. So the people who paid for an account with Snapchat were getting this My AI feature, and there was no notice. It was suddenly rolled out overnight into every onto every account. So parents were saying to me, no, my child doesn't have that feature. And I'd say, yes, they do. If they have Snapchat, yes, they do. And it was designed to sort of seem as this very friendly kind of, you ask me anything type thing. But there was, researchers were very quick to find weaknesses and loopholes in the information it was returning. Like it often would forget it was speaking to a child, for example. Even if the researcher had said, I'm 10 years old at the outset of the conversation, 2 or 3 questions in, it was forgetting and it was starting to return inappropriate information. Luckily, I don't know whether it was due to pressure or what the change was, but they have now made it so that parents can disable that feature. But then Meta, a few weeks ago, introduced this AI feature onto WhatsApp, which they describe in their terms and conditions as optional. But when I inquired, because I was really concerned, 40% of 8 to 12-year-olds have a WhatsApp account. And I inquired because it did say optional. And it also said, well, it may not return accurate or appropriate information. So I said, could you clarify whether this is a feature that can be unsubscribed from so that we can let parents know? A, that it's there, and B, that it's something that they can, as I say, unsubscribe from if they so wish for their child. And it took about 10 days to get the response, but eventually I was told, no, you can't. And it just frustrates me deeply. WhatsApp have been introducing these new things, including this, but also disappearing messages, following the Snapchat example, and lock chat, so that you can more easily hide. And when you consider how young children are when they're getting access to that service, it is really concerning. And they're not providing those extra supports to parents and that optionality that they claim that they are. So I think these things are being rolled out without proper testing, without due consideration for the age and profile of users. And I think that's irresponsible, quite frankly. And regulation hasn't caught up. So, Meta and Snapchat were able to do those things without any accountability. And that frustrates me deeply that we're always one step behind. And that needs to change. And I go back to this issue of safe by design, safe by default. That is what we need. That is the ideal for children. And that is where we need to get to.
Yeah, I found that I get the sense that, especially like within like these tech platforms, there's very much like a move fast and break things type of mentality when it comes to like rolling out products. Would you say then that like when they do this without that proper due consideration, it could feasibly actually pose like a big, safety risk then for youth and children online, especially if parents and guardians aren't, they don't have guidance on how they can mitigate it or navigate, these new functionalities.
Oh, absolutely. It's hugely irresponsible. And we've got to stop talking about this idea. We're pitting safety against things like innovation and against things like privacy. And we shouldn't be pitting them against. We should be considering all of those things when designing products and services. It is just a false narrative to suggest that it's not possible to achieve those things. It might cost more money to achieve those things, but, quite frankly, it's what's needed. And that's, this is what regulation should be ensuring, that there is that due consideration for the age and profile of your users. And in fact, not just children, all users. I don't know about you, but I don't particularly like the recommender system and the way it works and the aggressive nature of it and all the social problems that it is greatly amplifying. I mean, we could just talk about pornography as an example. That is an extremely powerful industry that is being recommended even to children, is by its nature largely very misogynistic, does lacks conversations around things like consent, for example. And it is, we know from research that children as young as 12, and the average age, according to Common Sense Media in the US, the average age at which a child first encounters pornography is 12. And that is not necessarily because they're going out looking for it. It's because it's being served up to them or shared with them, in a way that maybe they weren't even looking for it, So I think, it is muddying the water. But going back to generative AI, I do think there's serious concern around things like the artificially created child sexual abuse material. Again, this is a growing problem. The Internet Watch Foundation in the UK has been monitoring this and producing reports on it since 2023. And again, it's a problem that's growing.
So I think This would be a good kind of segue, I think, into our final question, because obviously this all sounds very scary, and I think that a lot of parents, guardians, or even educators will probably feel very overwhelmed or panic, or they might feel bad about trying to like be the bad cop of, enforcing policies in their own homes. But are there resources or strategies you can point to that can help them navigate this? Because it seems, an increasingly complex area for like a lot of families.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's lots of great resources out there to support parents and guide parents. And I think one key thing actually is to reach out to other parents. The more you have a community of support around you who maybe share some of your concerns and maybe want to, for example, hold off or not give access to certain apps, it's a lot easier to say to your child no or not yet if you know others are doing the same. So conversations with others and the parents of your child's peer group would be one strategy. And as I say, there is this grassroots movement of parents who are concerned and are looking to do things and intervene in a positive way. Conversations remain fundamentally important at any age. So these reminders and they chat not just about the bad stuff, but about all of it, what they're encountering online, what they enjoy about, and enjoy doing online, maybe trying to share some of those experiences. So if gaming is a particular interest, game with them. If, watching shorts on YouTube, which I find really difficult. I'm like, oh my gosh, I couldn't, but this is what kids love. They're these shorts, So trying to show an interest, but engaging them in some of the conversations around, what's real and what's not real. How do you fact check? How do you know something is true? And that reminders about that important piece, which is if you see something online that in any way makes you uncomfortable, come and talk to me, that trusted adult piece. And it may be you as the parent, or it may be an aunt or an uncle or a teacher, but knowing that they have a trusted adult they can talk to without judgment. Because a lot of kids fear that their device or their access will be taken away if they do tell. So we need to try and be, as parents and caregivers, as non-judgmental as we can in having these conversations. There's great guidance. Obviously, our website, I'm going to promote that, CyberSafeKids.ie. I mentioned the Same Rules Apply campaign. We have some support resources around that, including a digital parenting guide, which is available on our website. We've got other good talking tips and things like that available on our website as well. We do parent talks. We go into schools. But there are other fantastic places to go. So Common Sense Media, I mentioned earlier, which is a US-based nonprofit, do fantastic campaigns, really great resources. And to be honest, they're like a real go-to. So if your child comes home and says they want to be on Snapchat, for example, go and look it up. Go and see what the experts say. Then you can make a more informed decision about whether or not it's right for your child. And it may be that you want to hold off a bit longer on something like that. But even something like Roblox, which is marketed to and for children and looks very childlike, there are risks there as well. So again, go and get advice and see if it's right and use the parental controls. Roblox happens to have actually quite good parental controls. So, even if you're deciding, yes, I'm okay with my child playing this game or being on this app, use the things that are available to you. Snapchat also has parental controls. I mentioned you could disable, for example, the My AI feature. You can ensure your child is using ghost mode on the Snap Maps. You can keep an eye on their friends list and who they're chatting with, because unfortunately, Snapchat makes it extremely easy to connect with people that you don't know, and it's constantly recommending people to you. So it's very easy for children and young people to connect with people that may seem like a friend of a friend or and so on. So that's something to be mindful of. Webwise.ie has lots of great resources and campaigns as well. So really, for what I would say to parents is, if your child is online, then it's time to roll up your sleeves and be online with them and navigate through it with them and keep these conversations alive, and especially when they're younger. And even keep an eye on the device. Again, when they're younger, check in on those apps, check in on the settings, check in on the friends lists. As they get older and into their teens, it does become more difficult, of course, and they need a greater degree of independence and privacy and so on. But then those conversations and the healthy habits in the household is how so keeping devices out of bedrooms, keeping devices kind of away from the table when you're sitting down and having a meal, having device-free time if you can, like a Friday night once a month, where you're all, including parents. And the rules apply to the parents too, right? That they're also keeping their devices out of the bedrooms and so on. So there's things that you could be doing at all stages, and lots of good advice out there to guide your decision making.
Alex, thank you so much for joining. This has been very insightful. Always a pleasure. I want to thank everyone else for listening today. I think that would be a good place to wrap things up. And until our next episode, remember, stay connected and be nice in the comments section. Thank you.